Hello, my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and we are here with the last chapter of Emily's Runaway Imagination by the amazing Beverly Cleary, and Chapter 9, Emily and Fong Quock. And so the little library grew. Mama sent away for Black Beauty, and Emily read it 3 times, even though she did not think it as good as Muriel said it was. It was a sad book, but that part was all right. Emily enjoyed reading sad things. It was fun to cry over a book, and Mama said wait till she got to Little Women. It was the way the horses chatted about their aches and pains that bothered Emily. Horses in Pitchfork neighed, whinnied, and nickered. They did not have long visits with each other about their troubles. Mama wrote a gift from Emily Bartlett in the front of the book, and the Pitchfork Library had 1 more volume. It had, in fact, many more books because Mama had bought them with the money from the Hard Times party. The rest of the money would be used to pay Pete Ginty to build some real library shelves. There was even some talk around Pitchfork that the next time there was an election, people might vote some money for the library. Right now, the trouble was that the library was outgrowing the corner of the commercial club rooms, but never mind, Mama would figure out something. Emily had faith. One morning in February, Emily was thinking about the library as she sat at the kitchen table with paper, crayons, mucilage, and a bunch of pussy willows that she had picked in the pasture. She was making a valentine for her cousin Muriel in Portland. First, Emily folded the piece of paper in half, cut out half a heart, opened the paper, and then there was a whole heart. Then, with her brown crayon, she drew a fence across the middle of the heart. On the fence, she squeezed 3 dots of mucilage, and on each dot she pressed a fat pussy willow blossom. With her black crayon, she drew ears and tails on the pussy willow blossoms. There, she had 3 furry kittens sitting on a fence, kittens with fur that you could really pet. The poem came next. This Emily printed in red crayon. As long as kittens mew, I love you. Guess who? It was not as stirring as the poems Miss Plotkin made the class memorize in school. Things like, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. But it did rhyme, and that was something for a made-up poem. Emily finished the Valentine with a red and yellow border. Mama dried her hands on a huck towel and came to admire Emily's work. That is a very nice Valentine, she said. Emily was pleased that Mama admired her Valentine, but she still had her doubts. I suppose that Muriel is making Valentines out of a store-bought box, she said. She could picture Muriel working at her Valentines in the city. She would be using little pieces of pleated paper to attach white paper lace to hearts already printed with roses and bluebirds. When Emily took Muriel's Valentine out of the envelope, the lace would jump at her with its little paper strings. I suppose so, agreed Mama, but I think your Valentine is much nicer. This was comforting. Mama knew a lot about a lot of things because she had gone to school in Chicago before she came out west to be a school teacher. Mama had even been to the opera. Reassured, Emily stuffed her Valentine into an envelope and licked the flap. She would ask Uncle Avery at the post office to cancel the stamp by hand instead of cranking the envelope through the canceling machine, which might squash the pussy willow kittens. You could go to the post office now, said Mama, and stop at the store for a pound of coffee. Emily glanced out of the kitchen window. There were a few patches of blue in the gray sky. She would not have to take her umbrella, but she would have to wear her new rubbers, which had been one of her practical Christmas presents. When Emily reached the corner in front of the farm, she was faced with a choice. To go the long way to the left, past the orchard, get her new rubbers muddy, and avoid passing Fong Quock's house, or to go straight ahead the short way on the boardwalk past Fong Quock's house and keep the shiny black newness on her rubbers. Emily loved new things, new boxes of crayons, new Montgomery Ward catalogs, and new rubbers. Emily chose the short way. What if she did see Fong Quock? Since the Hard Times party, Emily no longer worried at being laughed at. Everyone had laughed at her that night, and she had not minded a bit. In spite of her rubbers, which Mama had bought 2 sizes too large so that she would be sure to get the wear out of them, Emily, her valentine clutched in one mittened hand, hippity-hopped along the boardwalk, making a thumping noise whenever she hit a loose board. When she came to Fong Quock's house, she saw the old man standing in the front porch, studying the weather. He saw her, and she saw him. So there was no walking past pretending she was looking up at a bird in a tree or anything like that. Emily's pioneer ancestors would not have been shy about passing Fong Quock's house. Look at all the Indians that they had not been afraid to pass as they journeyed across the plains. Emily slowed to a dignified walk, smiled, and bobbed her head. Fong Quock smiled and bobbed his head back at her. Well, thought Emily, this is a good system if we don't spend too much time in each other's company. Blithely, she went hippity-hopping on her way. At the post office, she explained about the pussy willow kittens to Uncle Avery, who was sorting the morning mail. Then she went to Grandpa's store. "Hello, Grandpa," she said. "Mama needs a pound of coffee." Grandpa was busy writing up a grocery order. "Go ahead and wait on yourself, Emily," he said. Emily was glad it was coffee she had come for and not something easy, like a package of powdered sugar or a can of log cabin syrup. She hoped the old men who were sitting around the stove chewing tobacco and talking politics while they waited for Uncle Avery to sort the mail would notice her and think, "My, the way the girl measures coffee." Carefully, Emily weighed exactly 1 pound of coffee beans from the bin under the counter, not 1 bean more or 1 bean less, and then she dumped them into the red grinder and turned the handle that made the machine chew noisily and spray ground coffee into a container, which Emily emptied into a paper bag. How good it smelled. So far, none of the old men had paid any attention to her, which was a pity, because she had snapped open the paper bag with such a flourish. But suddenly, Emily was paying attention to the old men. One of them was saying, "Did you hear that old Fong Quock is going back to China?" "Yup," answered another old man, getting up to spit tobacco juice into the stove. "That's what they say." Emily stared at the old men, waiting for them to say more about this astonishing piece of news. One of the men pulled out his big round watch, opened it, and said, "Looks like about time for the mail to be out." And then all the old men got up and left the store. "Grandpa, is Fong Quock really going back to China?" Emily asked. "So I hear," answered Grandpa, adding up the grocery order. China! Someone from Pitchfork, Oregon was going across the broad Pacific to China. "When is he going?" Emily wanted to know. "Soon as he can get his affairs straightened out," said Grandpa. "Is he going to stay there?" Emily asked. "I expect so," answered Grandpa. "A trip like that at his age?" "How is he going to get there?" Emily asked. "I hear he is going to take the train to Frisco," said Grandpa. "From there, he will take the boat." Well, this was exciting. A real world traveler in Pitchfork. Mama always said travel was a wonderful thing. Not that people in Pitchfork did not travel. When Uncle Avery was a soldier during the war, he traveled all the way across the United States to New Jersey, where he peeled potatoes. And one winter before Daddy married Mama, he had a job guarding gold for Wells Fargo. He guarded it on a train all the way down to San Francisco, and no bandits ever held up that train, not with Daddy guarding the gold. And almost every day, someone took the train to Portland. Emily had been there herself several times, and the things she had seen: streetcars, policemen, A dog wearing a little coat. Imagine, a coat on a dog. And best of all, a restaurant where pats of butter were served on tiny dolls' plates. But no one in Pitchfork had ever gone as far as China. Of course, a lot of people had come a long way to be in Pitchfork. Mama had come from back east, so had Grandpa and Grandma. And when Grandpa was a little boy, his mother and father had brought him all the way from England on a sailing vessel. And then there were the pioneer ancestors who had come from Missouri in their covered wagons. But no one ever went back. Once people came to Pitchfork, they stayed. And now Fong Quock was going to China, and he wasn't coming back. Emily could hardly wait to tell someone such important news. The first person Emily met outside the post office was Pete Ginty, whose beard looked blacker and bushier than ever. "Hello there, Emily," said Pete Ginty. Emily simply had to tell someone the news. "Good morning, Mr. Ginty," she said politely. "Did you know that Fong Quock is going all the way back to China?" Pete Ginty leaned against the wall of the post office, hooked his thumbs in his belt, and looked at Emily. "So I hear," he said. "Fong told me so himself just a few minutes ago. Matter of fact, he was carrying a monkey wrench. Said he wanted to trade it for a girl about your age to take back to China with him." Emily did not know how to take that news. She looked at Pete Ginty. His eyes were not smiling. She could not tell about his mouth in all of those whiskers. "What for?" she asked suspiciously. "Because he has only got sons and grandsons in China," answered Pete Ginty. "Oh," was all Emily could say. Did he mean Fong Quock wanted to trade her for a monkey wrench and take her back to China? My goodness, she didn't want to go to China. Go to China and leave Mama and Daddy and Grandpa and Grandma? I should say not. Probably Pete Ginty was trying to tease her, but if he was, he gave no sign. "Yep, told me so just a few minutes ago," said Pete Ginty. "Well, so long, Emily." "Goodbye, Mr. Ginty," said Emily faintly as she went into the post office. My goodness, what a terrible thought, to be traded for a monkey wrench. Surely this was all a joke, but Emily could not be sure. She recalled how Pete Ginty used to brag about how he could play the piano using only the black keys. Daddy said this was just some more of Pete Ginty's humbug, until one day, when he came to the sitting room door to speak to Daddy about cutting some wood in the pasture, he stepped inside to the piano and played Up a D all on the black keys. So now Emily did not know what to think. But she was sure about one thing. Mama and Daddy would never trade her for a monkey wrench or even a dozen monkey wrenches. But now, what was she going to do? If she ran into Fong Quock, he might ask her to go back to China with him. Even if he didn't, she might think that he did, because he was so hard to understand. And what on earth would she say? If she said, "No, thank you, I do not care to go to China," when he had not asked her, he would think she was mighty strange. Clutching her coffee in her mitten-covered hands, Emily walked slowly down Main Street. The next person that she came to was old George A. Barbie, whom she saw rather than met, because he was lying on his back under his Ford. My, this was certainly Emily's morning to run into Beard's. "Good morning, Mr. Barbie," said Emily, bending over to peer at him. "Morning, Emily," answered the old man, looking out from under his car. There was a dab of grease on his gray beard. "Did you know that Fong Quock is going back to China?" asked Emily, still eager to share the exciting news. "So I hear." Old George A. tapped at his car with his wrench. Maybe Emily could find out something from old George A. "I heard he wanted to trade a monkey wrench for a girl about my age to take back to China," she ventured. Old George A. stuck his head out from under the car. "Pete Ginty tell you that?" he asked. "Yes," answered Emily. "Yes, he did." So it was true. Old George A. knew that Pete Ginty knew. Oh dear, now she really would have to avoid Fong Quock. It was easy to see that the old man was too busy to talk, so Emily went on. When she came to the corner, she paused to make up her mind. The short way on the boardwalk to keep the new look on the rubbers, the long way past the orchard and through the mud to avoid passing Fong Quock's house. This time, Emily chose the long way. She could not expect to keep the new look on her rubbers forever. Gingerly, Emily stepped off the walk onto the muddy road. Oozy mud, the color of chocolate, sucked at her rubbers. Walking was not easy, she soon discovered, because her rubbers were too big. If she lifted her feet too fast, her rubbers stuck in the mud. Emily walked carefully, lifting her toes out of the mud before her heels so that her rubbers would stay on. Mama would think she was never coming with the coffee. Once, Emily forgot and lifted her heel first. Her foot came up and her rubber stayed in the mud. This was a problem. She had to hang on to the coffee, keep her coat up out of the mud, and pull on her sticky rubber while balancing on one foot. It was quite a trick, especially since she was wearing mittens. After that, she kept her eyes on the road to find the places that looked the least muddy. When she came to the blacksmith shop, her friend Mr. Wilcox opened the door and called out, "Hello there, Emily. What do you think you are doing, waiting in that mud?" Emily was embarrassed. "Going home. I've been to the store." Mr. Wilcox shook his head, as if he could not understand Emily's behavior. "This is plain silly." Emily told herself sternly that Pete Ginty was only trying to tease her. Or was he? She had expected him to tease her the day she Cloroxed the horse, and instead he had helped her. Emily's feet started to fly out from under her, but she managed to grab a bush and at the same time hang on to the coffee. It would never do to drop the coffee in the mud, not with coffee at such a high price these days. Emily stayed on her feet until she reached the Bartlett property, where she wiped her rubbers on the grass, which was brown and soggy from the long winter rains. She removed her rubbers on the back porch, and as she went into the kitchen, she called out, "Mama, I'm home." "All right, Emily," Mama answered from upstairs. Something caught Emily's eye and made her glance out of the kitchen window. And whom should she see walking along the side of the house but Fong Quock? He was wearing a plaid mackinaw over his overalls, and on his head was a battered old hat. He was carrying a monkey wrench. Emily stared, fascinated, until he turned the corner of the house. When she heard his foot on the back steps, she moved fast. Where could she hide? She lifted the lid of the wood box. It was too splintery. The footsteps advanced up the back steps and walked across the porch. Emily darted into the bathroom, closed the door, and leaned against the chill white edge of the second bathtub in Yamhill County. There was a knock at the back door. Emily held her breath. She heard Mama moving about upstairs. Another knock, harder this time. Mama's heels came tapping down the stairs, down the hall, across the dining room to the back door. "Why, hello, Fong Quock," cried Mama. "Won't you come in? I'm sorry to keep you waiting at the door, but I thought Emily was down here." Then Mama called out, "Emily, where are you?" Emily did not answer. She was leaning against the second bathtub in Yamhill County, and that was where she was going to stay. She heard Fong Quock step into the dining room and say something that she could not catch. "Oh, you're welcome," answered Mama. Outside in the woodshed, which was only a few feet from the house, Daddy began to chop wood. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Between thunks, Emily could tell that Fong Quock was having a long talk with Mama. She strained her ears, but she could not catch what he was saying. The farm began to seem like an extraordinarily noisy place. The windmill creaked. The cowbell tinkled. The hen told the world how clever it was to lay an egg. "Why, Fong Quock!" exclaimed Mama. "Are you sure?" Thunk, thunk. Emily opened the bathroom door and listened, waiting to hear Mama say, "Why, no, I wouldn't dream of letting Emily go all the way to China." Thunk, thunk. She thought the old man said something about many friends and all likey me, but she was not sure. She did wish he would speak up. "What a wonderful thing for you to do!" exclaimed Mama unexpectedly. What was wonderful? Emily wondered, straining to catch Mama's next words. And what it will mean to Emily, she heard Mama say. It will open a whole new world for her. Emily was shocked. A whole new world? Could that new world be China? Was Mama accepting Fong Quock's offer to take her to China? Mama had always said travel was a wonderful thing, but to send her only daughter and Grandpa's only granddaughter all the way to China? But Emily was sure she had heard her mother correctly. Mama had said it would open a whole new world for her. And now Mama was saying, I can't wait to tell Emily. She will be so excited she will not know what to do. Oh, I will I? Thought Emily indignantly. No, I won't, because I do not want to go to China. Mama didn't need to sound so happy. Thunk, thunk. Where did that girl go? Said Mama. She was here just a minute ago. Emily! Emily did not budge. I guess she has gone out to the barn, said Mama. Emily could hear her mother and Fong Quock walking toward the back door. The door was opened. We shall miss you, Fong Quock. Everyone will, said Mama, but we will never forget what you have done. Goodbye, goodbye, called Fong Quock as he went down the steps. Mama closed the door and returned to the kitchen. Emily was not scared anymore. She was mad, just plain mad. Mama was not going to send her off to China because she wasn't going to go. That was all there was to it. She was not going to go. Emily burst out of the bathroom. I don't care what you say, Mama. I won't go. Mama looked startled to see Emily appear so suddenly from the bathroom. Go where? She asked. Emily's eye fell on the monkey wrench lying on the kitchen table among her crayons and pussy willows. To China with Fong Quock, said Emily. I don't care if you did trade me for a monkey wrench. I don't care if you do think everyone should travel. Mama sat down weakly in the kitchen chair. She looked both baffled and amused. Emily, she said, will you please stop acting as mad as a wet hen and tell me what under the sun it is that you are talking about? About sending me to China, said Emily. What else could she be talking about? Pete Ginty told me that Fong Quock wanted to trade a monkey wrench for a girl about my age to take to China because he only had sons and grandsons there. Mama stared at Emily with a look that was a mixture of love, exasperation, and amusement. Oh, Emily, the way you let your imagination run away with you, she exclaimed. Emily calmed down and glanced once more at the monkey wrench. But Pete Ginty said, oh, that man, snapped Mama. You should know better than to believe any of his yarns. But he really can play the piano on the black keys, answered Emily uncertainly. Emily, Fong Quock came here to return the monkey wrench your father loaned him. Pete Ginty was just teasing you, said Mama. You should have known that. Emily felt better, but she did not see how she was supposed to know Pete Ginty had been teasing her. It was so hard to tell when about grown-ups sometime, but you said it would open a whole new world for me, she said doubtfully. I was talking about the world of books, many books instead of a few from the state library. Mama smiled at Emily. I didn't tell you the other reason why Fong Quock was here. What other reason? Asked Emily. Whatever it was, it must be good news because Mama looked so excited and happy. He said that times are so hard that he can't find anyone to buy his house. So he has decided to give it to the people of Pitchfork to use for a library. Mama smiled at Emily. Now what do you think of that? Mama, cried Emily, a whole house? A whole house, answered Mama. And the best part is that since we have a house for the library now, I know the people of Pitchfork will vote money for the library in the next election. Emily couldn't think of a thing to say. A real library in a house all by itself. Fong Quock's little house, the closest to her own. How handy! Poor old fellow, Mama remarked sadly. He says he has many friends here and that everyone likes him, but just the same, I know he must have been lonely many times. Why, Mama? Asked Emily. He did not look lonely to her. He always went to church, and she often saw him on Main Street talking to people. Because when he came to Oregon to seek his fortune as a young man, he settled in a strange town and had to learn a new language and new customs. He must have been homesick many times, even though in the early days there were other Chinese who came here to seek their fortune. Emily felt ashamed of herself for avoiding such a nice old man, a remarkable man, who was giving a whole house to the library, and to think he had been lonely right here in Pitchfork. Emily looked at her crayons and mucilage and pussy willows still scattered on the kitchen table. "Mama, do you think Fong Quock would like a valentine?" she asked. Mama smiled. "I'm sure he would." That settled it. Emily went right to work with paper and crayons. She squeezed 3 drops of mucilage on her crayon fence and pressed 3 pussy willows on the dots. Then, with red crayon, she painted, "As long as kittens mew, Fong Quock, I love you. Guess who?" In tiny letters down in one corner, she printed her initials before she slipped the valentine into an envelope. Then Emily put on her coat and her rubbers again and went hippity-hoppity down the boardwalk all the way to Fong Quock's house. She tiptoed up to his porch, soon to be the porch of the library, where she intended to slip her valentine under the door. Now she discovered the pussy willow kittens were too fat, so that she leaned her valentine against the door where the old man could not miss it when he came out. As Emily was tiptoeing down the walk, Fong Quock, who must have been watching her all the time, opened the door and picked up the valentine. He opened the envelope and studied the kittens with a smile on his wrinkled old face. Then he looked at Emily and smiled and nodded his head. Emily smiled and nodded her head. Fong Quock waved, and Emily waved back. With a light heart, Emily went hippity-hopping on her way home. This remarkable man, who had given his house for a library and who was going to travel all the way to China, knew that someone in Pitchfork was thinking of him. And just think, now Pitchfork was going to have a real library, and she, Emily Bartlett, was the girl who almost a year ago had licked the stamp that went on the envelope that held the letter to the state library that started the whole thing. Yes, Emily decided, she was pretty lucky to have the kind of imagination that ran away. And that is the end of a very special book. And let's look at the pictures. So here's a picture of the valentine that Emily made. And this one does not say Fong Quock, so this is the one that was to her cousin. And then there's a picture of Fong Quock waving at Emily. And let's see if there are any more pictures. Because that is the... there's another picture. There's a picture of Emily leaning against the second bathtub and listening to her mother and Fong Quock talk. And she thought that she was going to be traded for a monkey wrench and that she was going to have to go to China. She did not want to go to China without Mommy and Daddy. And that is the end of Emily's Runaway Imagination by Beverly Cleary. And this lady, Beverly Cleary, has given us such wonderful books. I just love her writing. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.